Hello, I'm Dr. David Santos, and we're continuing our study in pagan myths and religions, continuing in the classical period. And in this video, we're going to be looking at the theft of fire and the cost of knowledge. We have a couple great stories to be looking at. Let's jump into our introduction. And as an introduction, we want to understand that throughout history, human civilization has really grappled with these tensions between the pursuit of knowledge and consequences that often accompany that knowledge. There's all kinds of myths and religious traditions around this. We see literary works across cultures that explore this dynamic, and it really serves to portray knowledge as both a divine gift and a potential curse. So the acquisition of wisdom really often comes at a cost, whether through divine punishment, exile, suffering, or as seen in numerous foundational narratives, these just a continuation of consequences for the gaining that kind of knowledge. One of the most enduring expressions of this theme, of course, is Prometheus, the Greek titan who defied Zeus by stealing fire for humanity. Fire in this context represents really more than just warmth or cooking. It signifies technological progress, intellectual enlightenment, and the advancement of civilization. In Prometheus's case, what takes place, he steals fire, he gives it to mankind, and he's caught, and he's chained up on a mountainside, and every day Zeus's eagle comes along, eats his liver, and every night his wounds are healed, and it starts all over again the next day. So yet, all that set into place, Prometheus' benevolence is met with this extreme consequence. And so we see this juxtaposition of Zeus in divine punishment being put upon Prometheus. In contrast, we see Prometheus having similar consequences, similar to what we see in the fall of Genesis, where we see Adam and Eve having one limitation, and that one limitation is not to touch this one tree. And yet, what is said about the tree? It's a tree of knowledge. And it's knowledge that they're supposed to gain this knowledge directly from God rather than seeking a shortcut in some senses. There's a lot more to the story, a lot more behind the theology of that, but that's enough for us at the moment. In both narratives, seeking forbidden knowledge disrupts the natural order, bringing suffering as a result. And as usual, how we try to portray these things is more modern people having a cultural memory of what took place in the antediluvian world. So pre-flood world, the stories come down generation to generation as people spread out following the Tower of Babel. Those stories get mythologized and they get changed in detail, but the overarching story type is still the same. So we see this theme exists beyond ancient myths as well, and religious texts into even later Christian literature. Tolkien's portrayal of the Númenóreans in the Silmarillion, anyways, and the Lord of the Rings, it really echoes the dangers of overreaching ambition. In this case, the Númenóreans, blessed with long life and wisdom, they ultimately fall into ruin because they seek immortality. And this defies the divine will. Their downfall serves as a moral warning, which is that similar idea of Prometheus, similar idea to original sin and the fall of mankind through Adam's sin. So we see an illustration of consequences of challenging the limits imposed by higher powers. In this study, we're going to examine these three key narratives: the theft of the fire by Prometheus in the fall of Genesis, and the fall of Genesis, and the downfall of Númenor, to demonstrate how different cultures have wrestled with the implication of knowledge. While the knowledge brings progress and enlightenment, it also carries the weight of responsibility when pursued recklessly. It leads to punishment, leads to suffering, and by comparing these stories, we can gain insight into how ancient and modern traditions both have shaped our understanding of the fine line between wisdom and arrogance. All right, so our first narrative is the Greek myth Prometheus and the Theft of Fire. The myth of Prometheus, it's one of the most enduring narratives in Greek mythology. And as you know from previous videos, it's our intention here to hit on some of the most prominent of the Greek myths and give you a feeling for the narrative and basically a summary version of that myth as we go through and study these myths and try to apply them to our Christian worldview. It illustrates this double-edged nature of knowledge that we've been talking about. Prometheus, who is a titan, he's known for his cunning, intelligence, and affinity for humanity. He defies Zeus by bestowing fire upon mankind. This is a direct act of defiance against Zeus, and it establishes Prometheus as both a benefactor and transgressor, and his subsequent punishment serves as a warning against overstepping divine boundaries. It's a story which has been interpreted in a lot of different ways. It reflects the Greek understanding of human suffering and a consequence of ambition and rebellion. First point here is Prometheus as a benefactor of humanity. In this story, Prometheus' name means forethought, signifying his ability to plan ahead and his role as a protector of mankind. In Hesiod's Theogony, lines 507 to 616, and the works and that's not the work, it's just and works and days, lines 42 to 105, and Asclepius's Prometheus Bound. Prometheus emerges as a figure who challenges divine authority for the sake of humanity, of human progress. According to the myth, Zeus withheld fire from humanity as a means of maintaining divine supremacy. Withholding that kind of technology makes the gods far more superior to the humans who would have fire. Fire, however, was essential for human development. It allows them to cook and move into new kinds of craftsmanship and develop new technologies and have more innovation in their civilizations. So, thus, Prometheus, moved by compassion, a sense of justice, he comes down from Mount Olympus and steals fire from the gods, hiding it inside a hollow fennel stalk to deliver it safely to mankind. So we see within this fire as a symbol of enlightenment. Fire is not just a practical tool, it represents the intellectual and technological advancement. Asclepius's works expand on Prometheus' contribution beyond fire. And in that work, he's credited with teaching humanity essential arts and sciences. Here's a quote from Prometheus Bound, lines 442 to 7. Listen then, to learn what arts, what aids I cleverly devised for humankind. First, I gave them thought and wisdom, and I taught them number and letters. Before me they saw, yet saw in vain. They heard, but did not understand. So, giving them new knowledge was an important part of this. This passage highlights Prometheus as a cultural hero. He doesn't just grant them fire, but he really ignites the human mind with reason and creativity and civilization itself. Then we move on to the wrath of Zeus, where Zeus is enraged by Prometheus' defiance. He enacts this one of the most severe punishments you can see here demonstrated, this continual, everlasting torture. And the myth underscores a key in the Greek theme The gods do not tolerate challenges to their authority, and those who overstep their limits must suffer the consequences. So we see this eternal punishment. Zeus orders that Prometheus be bound to the rock, where this eagle comes along, tears out his liver, and eats it, only for Prometheus to regenerate and this cycle to begin again. From Theogony, we see, with unbreakable bonds, he bound wily Prometheus and set a great eagle upon him, and it fed on his liver, which grew back every night. So the perpetual agony here reflects not only Zeus's vengeance, but also the Greeks' view of suffering and inevitable consequence of challenging divine power. Prometheus' suffering serves as a tale that gives caution about the dangers of arrogance. And it's really not, it's more than arrogance, more than hubris, because his intent was to break up the order and take and give technology to the humans. To this, the Greeks saw an action of defiance against the gods as a perilous act, often resulting in this tragic consequence. In Prometheus Bound, the Titan himself recognizes his fate but remains defiant, stating, quote, "I knew all this before. I chose to sin. I chose to suffer." And that's in Prometheus Bound. The defiance reinforces the idea that suffering is not merely inflicted by the gods, but is also a consequence of human choice. So, an interesting story, and we're going to see some parallels here. And before we move into those others, I just want to look through a couple quick points on the interpretation of the myth. The myth of Prometheus has been subject to a lot of different interpretations throughout history, and especially concerning the relationship between knowledge, suffering, and human ambition. The story presents really this paradox where Prometheus's gift elevates humanity, yet also brings suffering. This theme is again echoed in other myths such as the biblical account of the fall, where knowledge leads to exile and hardship. In the Greek worldview, the acquisition of wisdom is gaining this wisdom. It's really defines what humanity is. It also brings pain and burdens. And I think burden is the main point there, because there's a duality of knowledge and that suffering. Knowledge is further emphasized in these stories in the punishment of humanity itself. After Prometheus's defiance, Zeus creates Pandora, the first woman, and gifts her with a jar. It's the pithos. The jar containing all manners of suffering. And when Pandora opens the jar, evils are unleashed upon the world, leaving only hope inside. And some translations, hope is under the lid. This suggests that with progress and enlightenment come unintended consequences, which is a sentiment reflected in many other cultural narratives. A lot of people have considered, well, why is hope still inside? Why is hope in the jar at all? And many of the scholars have tried to build an understanding of what suffering is and what hope is. And I think it's an important concept for us to understand. Suffering is in the jar, hope is in that jar of suffering, because hope in the literature is something that can seem like it brings suffering, or even is an aspect of suffering. So as all of these evil things go out, hope hangs around. And you can have hope that things are going to get better, but maybe they never do. That's one way people see hope in relationships to suffering. There's a number of ways that it's examined in that kind of fashion. When hope works out, then it's a wonderful thing. Now, the biblical idea of hope is way different, because when we talk about hope, we see an expectation of the fulfillment of God's promises. So just if we want to grab and look at a couple verses just to illustrate what we've been talking about, we can do that. First one, Ephesians 4, and as you can see, I just pulled up a Bible word study over here. Here's 54 verses with the word hope in it. It's the word elpis, hope, expectation. Like I was saying, it's an expectation of what God's promise is. We can look. Here's from my my library of not dictionaries, lexicons here. See, from BDAG, one of our most important ones. It's hope, expectation, foundation of hope, expectation, hope, expectancy, the hope of. It's not wishing upon a star or whatever metaphor you want to use. There's also an object of hope and hoping it's, so we see all those things. But just let's show you how the Bible uses it. In Ephesians here, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long-suffering, bearing with one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bonds of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, and just as you're called, in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all things, and through all, and in all, and in you all. So this idea of hope here is one of expectation based on your calling, and it's an effective calling is what they're talking about there. It's one that's been responded to, but more than that, it's putting it into God's authority. Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for. So faith is that substance of something that's been hidden and is now being revealed. It's the expectation of that thing coming to pass. It's the evidence of things not seen, but it's understanding what God's promises are like. He doesn't randomly promise things and then yank them away. They are eternal. We desire that each one of you show the same diligence to the full assurance of hope until the end. So there's a side of diligence and the full assurance. And the full assurance is simply because it's God's promise that is being fulfilled. And God doesn't break his promises. Goes on that you do not become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. So giving you direction that's based on that hope. Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So the idea of resting is feeling secure in a hope. And that hope is fully based upon grace that is brought to you. You're not working for, trying to gather up, trying to do something for, brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So, all important passages. It goes on from there. We could grab lots and lots more. I think we'll leave it at those ones for now. But the contrast is going to be the biblical idea of hope with the Greek understanding of hope. All right, so continuing on here. Unlike the Christian understanding of suffering as a result of sin, the Greek view sees suffering as a fundamental part of the human condition, often linked to really linked to ambition. Prometheus like many tragic figures in Greek mythology, he suffers not because he is inherently evil, but because he challenged the order of things. His story reflects the Greek notion that suffering and struggle are things that cannot be separated. This idea is echoed in the tragedies of figures like Oedipus and Achilles, both of whom possess these extraordinary abilities, but also suffer due to their choices. The Greeks saw suffering as a means of achieving wisdom, which is learning through suffering. Patai mathos is the phrase there. Learning through suffering. And Prometheus' ordeal exemplifies this. So the conclusion here is that the myth of Prometheus embodies the tension between progress and punishment, ambition and suffering. By stealing fire, Prometheus grants humanity the means to thrive, yet he himself endures eternal torment for his defiance. The Greeks viewed knowledge as a force of both empowerment and peril, acknowledging that great advancement often comes with profound costs. This dual perspective resonates in later traditions, including the biblical and Christian thoughts, where the pursuit of knowledge outside divine sanction leads to downfall. In Prometheus, therefore, stands a powerful symbol of both enlightenment and defiance, and his story serves as this timeless account on the limits of human ambition and the price of transgression. All right, so we won't spend a lot of time here, but we do want to definitely mention and highlight the story of the fall of Genesis. It's one of the most profound narratives concerning the pursuit of knowledge and its consequences. And that's true whether we're looking at the biblical account as believers or if someone who's not a believer simply looking at the narrative as a mythological story. So I'm not implying this is myth because I am a believer and I take the Bible seriously. But for those who don't, well, repent, get saved, first of all. Come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. But if we're examining this from a literary perspective, we can see the account, and we should definitely be able to see where it fits into our cultural knowledge that is then expanded into mythology, and that's my preferred way to look at it. And we know the story, and most people, whether they believe or not, they know the story. Like the myth of Prometheus, it tells a story of tension between human sin and divine boundaries. Adam and Eve's desire for wisdom really is the mechanism by which the serpent's temptation is able to reach in to their desires and exploit them, especially of Eve's desire. And Eve's desire was for one thing, Adam's was for another, and it's really Adam who sins. Eve is deceived. So the weight of the sin lands upon Adam. This ancient account reflects a universal theme. It's a theme that begins in the garden as an actual account and comes to us through a lot of different stories and myths. From that perspective, in the stories that come out of this, we see accounts that reflect this universal desire for knowledge gained through defiance of divine command, resulting in punishment, exile, and suffering. The heart of Genesis narrative is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it is off limits. Eve takes it at the urging of the serpent, and I think we can talk a lot about serpents moving forward. We won't do that too much today, but we've actually already had some other videos on the serpent as well, so you can check those out. However, you can simply see there's this command, don't eat of this tree, And when confronted with the serpent, the dragon, we've had topics of dragons as well. Might want to probably see it that way. The devil, Satan, actually it's often referred to as the Satan. Eve is confronted by the serpent. Eve says, we're not even supposed to touch the tree. Of course, that isn't what God said. And that's not fully standing on the Word of God is where things go sideways here. The serpent there is later identified in Revelation 12:9 as the dragon, who is Satan. In this case, Eve is lured away, and we know this verse, Genesis 3:5. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And that was the great deception. 3:23 says, so the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. Now, understand also, within this series of verses, we also see the proto-evangelium, which means first good news, first gospel, in Genesis 3:15, where it says that it promises the Messiah. This is the first promise of that. So while you're being exiled, God says, I'm going to make a way for mankind to be redeemed, and all humans will be resurrected. There's a resurrection of the dead. There's a sorting that takes place. But this is the beginning of that. And the Messiah will be bitten on the heel by the serpent, and yet the Messiah will crush the serpent's head. And of course, Jesus did that on the cross. So there's a punishment for woman. There's increased pain in childbirth. For the man, hard labor. And all of humanity, there's mortality. So there's both inherited and imputed sin. Both come to all of humankind, man and woman, through that one sin. And Romans chapter 5, 12 through 21 is the watershed passage for that, how we understand that. All right, so let's take a very quick, brief understanding of the parallels between Genesis and Prometheus. And those two stories suggest this common motif in ancient thought, where knowledge is transformative, but also dangerous when pursued outside of divine sanctions. And that's really a big thing within scholarship and understanding of these things from a literary perspective. Prometheus defies Zeus by stilling fire, believing it will benefit humanity. Despite divine prohibition, Adam and Eve disobey God by eating from the tree, not an apple tree, seeking to gain wisdom apart from him. Spoiler alert, it was a pomegranate. In both cases, the transgressors are punished, establishing a clear boundary between divine authority and human ambition. Prometheus' fire enlightens mankind, leading to progress. The forbidden fruit opens Adam and Eve's eyes. But instead, in one case, it leads to divine wrath. In the other case, it leads to being shunned and long-term suffering. Both stories reflect a fundamental truth. Unchecked ambition and disobedience, even in pursuit of wisdom, lead to irreversible consequences. Of course, we recognize that the God of the Bible is a completely different God than the Olympians. Where they are anthropomorphic, God is not. God is anthropomorphic in the senses that help us understand who he is, but we understand that God doesn't have a throne because he doesn't sit. Jesus is at the right hand of the Father. The Father doesn't have a right hand. I mean, things like this. Those gods are more human than they're not in their stories. God cannot even be understood from the human mind. So we have to use these human characteristics to get pieces, little chunks of who he is. All right, so let's take a look at this Christian connection on this topic. Tolkien's Númenóreans and the arrogance of forbidden knowledge, the hubris of forbidden knowledge. J.R.R. Tolkien, deeply influenced by Christian theology, obviously, and also ancient myths, which you may not know as much, incorporated the themes of forbidden knowledge and the consequences to his legendarium. Now, nowhere is this more evident than in the story of Númenor, the great island kingdom of the Silmarillions and the Lord of the Rings. The Númenóreans, a blessed people, given wisdom and longevity, ultimately fall into destruction due to their insatiable desire for immortality, and they have a downfall. And it closely parallels, in some sense, the fall of Genesis, the punishment of Prometheus, and it reinforces the idea that defying divine authority in the pursuit of forbidden knowledge leads to ruin. The Númenóreans were a race of men specifically gifted by the Valar, which are the angelic beings of Tolkien's mythology, set apart from other humans in Middle-earth. They received great knowledge, advanced civilization, and extended lifespans as a reward for their loyalty to the Valar and their resistance against Morgoth, which is one of the satanic figures. The Númenóreans descended from the Idaean, the noblemen who aided the elves in the First Age, and were granted the island of Númenor as a paradise. They were instructed by the Valar and the elves, learning arts, shipbuilding, and the lore beyond other men. However, despite their wisdom and blessings, they harbored an inherent fear, which was their own mortality. Over time, the Númenóreans grew resentful of their mortality, inviving the undying. They looked at these elves that were either immortal or close to it, and they really desired that. They turned away from the Valar, seeking ways to extend their lives beyond what was divinely ordained. This culminated in the last king of Númenor launching an invasion against Valinor, the realm of the Valar, believing he could seize immortality by force. In response, Ilúvatar, that's Tolkien's equivalent of God, intervened directly, sinking Númenor beneath the sea and divine punishment for their arrogance. The Númenóreans' downfall here echoes the biblical story of Adam and Eve, as well as the Greek myth of Prometheus. Each narrative warns against overstepping divine limits. And just as Adam and Eve sought knowledge outside of God's will, leading to their expulsion from Eden, the Númenóreans sought to transcend their mortality and suffered annihilation. In a similar fashion, Prometheus' theft of fire, despite benefiting humans, resulted in eternal torment. Númenor's destruction mirrors Eden's expulsion. A paradise is lost due to human defiance. The drowning of Númenor resembles the great flood of the biblical tradition, a divine judgment, and that of Atlantis as well. So just as Prometheus is bound and tormented. The Númenóreans suffer exile. Those who survive become the faithful, scattered across Middle-earth, much like Adam and Eve laboring outside of Eden. Here, Tolkien's faith profoundly shaped his portrayal of pride, wisdom, submission to divine authority. Unlike the Greek mythology, where Prometheus is often seen as a heroic figure challenging tyranny, Tolkien emphasizes that true wisdom lies in humility and obedience. Tolkien's work consistently warns against pride as the root of destruction, seen not only in Númenor, but also in figures like Morgoth, Sauron, and even Saruman. Pride leads to an insatiable hunger for power and control, much like the Númenóreans yearning for immortality. And of course, the faithful remnants of Númenor, led by Elendil, reject this pride and instead accept their mortal fate. Couple final points here. Unlike Prometheus, who remains defiant, Tolkien's ideal characters submit to divine will. The faithful Númenóreans, including Elendil and his descendants, accept that mortality is a gift rather than a curse. The theme of subcreation, which is Tolkien's theological concept that humans should create within divine parameters rather than trying to rival God, it really reinforces the idea that true wisdom is found in humility and reverence. So in conclusion, the downfall of Númenor, much like the fall in Genesis, and the fate of Prometheus illustrates the dangers of seeking forbidden knowledge and power. Tolkien, drawing on both Christian and mythological traditions, presents Númenor's destruction as a tale that ends with punishment that really gives us caution to the direction they went. Rather, as we see Tolkien through Númenor, Tolkien weaves together this ancient theme into a distinctly Christian framework, which emphasizes that of humility rather than arrogance, which leads to true salvation. So we can conclude with just the proverb from 1618, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. For our application, we see the theme in these accounts of pride and defiance against divine authority is central to biblical thought and resonates across cultures and traditions. While knowledge and progress are valuable, when they're sought through arrogance and disobedience, they bring about suffering. They bring about things that we ought not be engaged in, like rebelliousness. And they do that in a way that gets in the way of our right relationship through God. Prometheus's punishment, Adam and Eve's exile, Númenor's destruction, they all serve as these tales that remind us that wisdom is not about grasping forbidden knowledge, but about understanding one's place within the true account and order. And in this case, as followers of the God of the Bible, we understand his place, we understand our place, and we understand that we have a mediator, Jesus Christ, who stands in between us. And he was a propitiation, a sacrifice that stood in place for our sin, cleansing us of sin and giving us a way to have a right relationship with God, being reconciled to him. Romans chapter 5, 1 through 4, 5. We're therefore no longer an enemy with God, but now a friend with God. It's an incredible thing to consider the gift that we've received through grace. So with that, if there's anything I can do for you, please let me know. And I just pray that the Lord will continue to bless your studies and enjoy making these videos. I hope you're enjoying them as much as I am as making them. And Lord bless you.